Hi, guys, and welcome back to the Intuition Activation Podcast. I'm so excited that you're here with me again. And this week's episode, we are going to be exploring what it means to actually hear messages from your spirit guides. We're going to cover whether clairaudience is your strength, and if it isn't, how you can begin to strengthen and develop this intuitive ability. And in combination with clairvoyance, which is what we talked about strengthening in last week's episodes. If you haven't listened to that one, definitely be sure to go check that out. And I really feel like when we combine the two, clairaudience and clairvoyance, it's really easy to get a much clearer message from our spirit guides and a message that we can really understand without sort of feeling like we're playing charades or guessing what does the image mean or what does the word mean, because we have sort of an input coming from two different senses. So I really want to dive into this topic and show you how we can use the two together to really start getting clear messages from our spirit guides. But before we do that, I just wanted to remind you that my intuition activation mini course is still out and available. So if you're ready to develop your intuitive abilities, start connecting to your spirit guides, and learn how to create a practice that works for you and receive messages from your spirit guides that are really clear and you're able to start speaking to them today, you don't want to wait for the rest of this Claire series to come out on the podcast, then definitely head over to my website, jessicarachel.co/mini course, and use the promo code intuition, all caps, and get 10% off of the course price. So definitely go and check that out. Also, I did just want to remind you or announce that I am having a promo code also for anybody who does want to have a spiritual guidance session with me. So you don't want to do the channeling yourself. You want me to do it for you. And I'm always happy to do that. So for podcast listeners, the same code, intuition, all caps, for 10% off a spiritual guidance session with me. But if you are thinking about doing it, I would head over to my website and get that booked as soon as possible. We are now booking into the month of April, and I will be taking a month off or possibly a little bit longer in May to welcome in my new baby when he or she arrives. So there will be a small hiatus that I will be taking. So if you don't want to wait into the summer or late spring to have your spiritual guidance session, I highly recommend going and booking your session now because spots are filling up fast. Again, use Como code intuition, all caps, and get 10% off of your session price. I can't wait to meet you in person and start channeling your beautiful guides for you, helping you find your path and purpose in this life. Finally, the last thing I want to share and remind you is that this podcast is also available on YouTube. So if you are listening on Apple or Spotify and you would like to see my beautiful face as we speak about all of these beautiful topics, please head over to my YouTube channel at I am Jessica Rachel and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. All right, enough of all of the announcements. Let's dive into today's episode, Claire Audience. Okay, so this literally translates to clear hearing or being able to hear messages from your guides. But what does that actually mean? Because I think a lot of us really have this preconceived notion that when we are channeling, it feels like something outside of ourselves, right? With clairvoyance, a lot of people expect they're going to see an apparition kind of come up in front of them as if I was seeing my hand in front of my face, or as if I was seeing a figure in front of me. And what we discussed last week is that's really not the case. It looks a whole lot like your own imagination. Well, this is the same case with clairaudience. It does sound a lot like the voice inside your own head, the way that your own thoughts sound. However, there is an easy way to start to distinguish, am I just thinking this or making this up, or am I actually channeling this? And the best way that I'm able to describe this for you is that when we are channeling, our the messages tend to come in to the back of our head as if it's like kind of that space behind, around the nape of your neck. Or sometimes as if it's coming from behind one or both of your ears. And our thoughts, on the other hand, they tend to kind of come in at the front of our head, kind of like a ticker tape that you see on the bottom of a news screen, across the front of your forehead, one thought after the other after the other. You also want to pay attention to the tone of the voice that's coming through. And while it does usually, and even for myself, sound like your own voice, There is a difference. See, when you're channeling, the voice always sounds calm and grounded and centered. And when it's your thoughts, it sometimes can feel a little hyper or a little more active, a little bit more, one thought after the other after the other. And when you're channeling and a message is coming through from your guides, again, even though it sounds like your own voice, it almost is as if, especially when you're starting out, it's like one word that comes in. And as soon as you start to register that word and kind of go, did I hear that correctly? It's like it vanishes or it disappears. And then maybe another one will come through. Now, of course, as you learn to develop this gift, the messages come through a little bit longer in a longer form. So, it starts with one word and then maybe it becomes a string of words, two or three together. And sometimes then eventually it sounds like full on sentences and like you're having a conversation. But even now, having been an experienced channeler for several years, there are still instances where it's just one word that comes through at a time. And I kind of go, okay, what's that one word? And then I'll ask for another one word. And so notice this word as it comes through. Notice where in your head you hear it. Is it at the back or is it at the front? Is it calm and grounded or is it one thought after the other after the other? Now, I will say that after having developed this gift over time, there are moments, especially when I'm in a deep meditation or, when I've really set the intention to call in my guides and I can see the guide clearly in front of me, that I am able to distinguish a different voice for the guide who is coming through. And it does seem different from my own. And, sometimes even to this day, I wonder if I'm imagining it to make it more fun. So, if I see a guide who looks like this, this little old lady, I'll hear sort of a lower register, an old lady voice that's kind of sweet and fragile. Or if it's a male guide, I will tend to hear a male voice as opposed to a female voice. And, however, often it still sometimes does just sound like my own voice coming through. And so know that especially when you're starting out, when you're beginning, it's not going to sound different than the voice inside your own head. And as I always like to remind you, this is so beautiful because once you start to distinguish that these messages are channeled, but that it's actually an experience you've already had before, you start to recognize that maybe you've been channeling messages from your guides your whole life and you just didn't know to identify it as that. And so now that you know how to start paying attention to it, you can start to maybe even look back on your life and realize, when were times that this type of message actually did come through for me? And so it's really important to, again, come to the realization that channeling is not something that feels so magical and so outside of ourselves because you are such a magical being that it should feel natural. It should feel normal. It's not going to be this eye-opening, life-changing experience over, sensory overload experience all the time, if ever. And just learning to sort of recognize that in the context of channeling, in the context of calling in your guides, even though it does feel like an experience you tend to have every day, because you've called your guides in, because you've asked them a question, in that moment, the experience that comes through, the thoughts that come through, the sounds in your head that come through in that context is you channeling. So now I'm going to get off my soapbox and let's talk a little bit more about sort of how you know if clairaudience is one of your predominant abilities. So one that comes to you a little bit more naturally than the others. So as I mentioned last week, clairvoyance is definitely my predominant gift. And when I started to kind of seek out my gifts, um, trying to start to connect with my spirit guides and really starting to try and get messages, it was a little bit frustrating at first to just receive visual cues or visual images in my mind. Often I felt like I was getting or I was playing a game of charades. And it was really frustrating to try and guess, like, what does this image mean? And I would sometimes only see an image of an animal or an image of a certain flower, and then, would get out of the meditation and then start Googling, like, what does this mean? And not really trusting, why did that come through, but even more importantly, understanding why it came through. And so I felt at that time maybe it would be really helpful for me to receive audio cues as well, to hear words words in conjunction with those message or with those images in order to get a clear understanding and a clear image. And it definitely helped. It makes me feel like I'm not guessing all the time. When my guide sent an image, I can then ask, what do you mean by that? And hear a word or a string of words that indicates what my guides were intending to show me. What do they mean? Is it metaphorical or is it literal, this image that they're showing me? And so, as I said, this was a gift that I sought out to strengthen. It was not one that came to me naturally. If it does come to you naturally, here are some signs that you might be predominantly clairaudient. And so, somebody who is an auditory learner, right? So you need to hear things or have them be explained to you out loud in order to understand it. This might be a clue that you are clairaudient. I know this is not the case for me. I need to see it to understand it. I need to read it to understand it. But if you are somebody who maybe prefers audiobooks, you understand the book better when you hear it, right? As opposed to when you read it, you absorb it easier that way. Remember that your guides are always trying to give you messages in a way that they feel you're going to receive it best. So my guides know I'm very visual. So they're always going to give me visual images first because I understand that best. But if that is not your strength, then they're not going to try and make you play charades as much, or they know you're not going to get the message as easily. So it might come through if you are better at understanding when something is explained to you, then maybe you are clairaudient. Okay. Somebody who might be clairaudient, and this is like, it can be the case, not always the case. You might be the type of person who likes having music on in the background all the time. You like always need to have a song playing. I know for me, this is not the case. I find it extremely distracting to my own thoughts. But there are some people who feel like they're not themselves unless there's music playing in the background. Again, because you enjoy that type of sensory input. And then this is something that's pleasing to you. Um, it might also be that you are musically inclined, right? Maybe you're good at playing an instrument, or you hear music notes really well, that kind of a thing. Again, it might be your strength, and so then there's a really good sign. There's not really a lot of other great signs about to tell if you're clairaudient, other than do you receive auditory messages more easily than other messages? And that's kind of the only way I can help you start to clue in, is maybe this is my strength. But what I do want you to notice is that you can begin to notice and strengthen your clairaudience without actually being in the context of channeling. And so these things I'm about to explain are things that maybe have already happened to you before. And this can also be a good indication that you might be clairaudient. And if it hasn't happened to you before, I want you to start to notice some of these things, because it is a good way to start developing this ability. And so this starts out in your conscious life. And so this is sort of like if you are wanting to get an answer from your guide, right? You have a question on your mind, and you are going to start to get auditory clues that show up in your everyday life. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, this can look like you have a question about something, you're pondering something, you kind of are dwelling on what the answer is going to be, you need to make a decision. And then you get in your car and you turn on the radio. It just so happens that the song that is playing, the lyrics happen to be extremely relevant to exactly what it is that you were thinking about or wanting to make a decision on. And it just feels like it can't be a coincidence that those lyrics came on in that moment. And newsflash, it wasn't a coincidence. This is a version of your guides trying to communicate with you. Another way that this can come through is if you are, again, dwelling on a question, or you have something you're trying to seek an answer for, and you happen to overhear a snippet of somebody's conversation. And once again, it just so happens that the thing they're talking about is extremely relevant to the problem at hand that you're trying to solve. Again, not a coincidence. Start to pay attention to these things, start to cultivate your awareness of these things, and pay attention to when these things pop up in your life. If this has happened to you a lot, then maybe you're predominantly clairaudience. And if it hasn't happened to you a lot, maybe it's time to start noticing those things, because this is when we start to, again, strengthen this ability. Another thing I want you to start to pay attention to is when songs suddenly or randomly get stuck in your head. This is almost always a message from your guides. Okay. It is not a coincidence that a random song pops up into your head and the lyrics usually have to tend to be extremely relevant to whatever it is that you are wondering about. And I'll give you a really funny example about this that happened to me. And this was way back when I was again just starting to try and develop my clairaudient abilities. A friend of mine had just had a little baby girl, and she had not announced to anybody what the name was going to be. And she was only, I think she was going to kind of have like a big announcement or something, but anybody who came to visit, she was going to tell the name. And so my husband and I were driving over to our friends to go and meet their new baby girl. And we were discussing, and I said, and wondering, I wonder what her name is going to be. And then we kind of like changed the subject. We kind of both, I don't know, we just fell into comfortable silence. And I start hearing the song, "A Thousand Years" in my head by Christina Perry. And then my train of thought kind of went to such a beautiful song. It's weird to me that it ended up in the Twilight series, which is such a random, chain of thoughts. And then I remember thinking, like, I wonder if the baby's name is going to be Isabella, like the character in Twilight. And then I turned to my husband and said out loud, I bet her name is going to be Isabella. My husband said, "That's so random. Where did that come from?" I don't know. It just occurred to me. And sure enough, we get in the door, we meet this baby girl, and that was what they named her. They had named her Isabella. And even more funny, they call her Belle or Bella for short, which is exactly the protagonist in the Twilight series. And so that one was a little bit more of a roundabout way. Like it wasn't so obvious. It's not like I heard a song with the name Isabella in it. I heard a song that reminded me of a movie where that was the protagonist, and I heard the song in my head, but again, it was so random that that popped up in my mind. Why was I suddenly humming this tune in my mind? And then sort of the chain of thoughts that preceded that kind of brought me to that conclusion, and I just trusted it, and sure enough, this was sort of proof for myself that I was in fact right. So that one was really, really good at helping me strengthen my ability or learning to trust my ability because, it was confirmed almost immediately, and I was correct. But I'll give you another example of this that's maybe slightly more obvious. And so for me, when I tend to sometimes get very stressed out, especially when it comes to having certain deadlines. And so, I'll get myself in a tizzy and I'll get all worked up. And then, suddenly I'll hear the song Relax by Micah or Mika in my head. And it's almost like my guide's reminding me to take it easy, right? Relax, take it easy. Please excuse my singing, right? And I hear that song just pop up randomly in my head and I can't get it out of my head until I finally take a moment, take a breath, recenter, ground, and come back to myself and stop stressing about whatever it is that I'm stressing about. And so, again, this is my guides communicating with me without me actually having set the intention of calling them in, but it's my guides looking out for me in that moment, kind of going, it's not good for you to be pumping all this cortisol into your body. Relax for a minute. It's not that important. And so, again, pay attention to when those songs pop up. I can guarantee you almost, 9 times out of 10, if not 100% of the time, it's not a coincidence. And when you start to pay attention to that, and then even more so, then you start to actually take the advice or trust that reason that came through or the message that comes through from it. Again, then you get proven right and you learn to trust it and it strengthens the ability. Another way that you can begin to start to strengthen your clairaudience is to actually ask your guides. And so, this is the easiest way to strengthen anything that you're trying to do or build your relationship with your guides is directly seek them out and ask them for their help. And so, similar to the process that I laid out in last week's episode for clairvoyance, you're going to do the same thing, right? You're going to do whatever it takes to get you out of your head and into your body. So, whether that's doing your breath work or doing a meditation, then you call in your guides, ask them to come and join you, and then set your intention. Spirits of the light, please reactivate and strengthen my hearing abilities. Ask them for their help. And when you do this, then you're going to start to work with them and practice with them in that moment. Go ahead and ask them a question that is objective to you, right? A question where you don't really care about the outcome either way. Again, the best example I can always come up with is what should I have for dinner tonight? Um, And, you probably don't care what the answer is either way. And so then you can really start to hear, a message coming through and learn to trust that. Or you can go ahead and ask a question that maybe it's advice for somebody else where you're not so married to the result. What should my friend do about this situation? And see again, does a voice pop up in the back of your head? What do you hear? And start to trust those messages. Trust also that when if a voice does come through, your voice comes through and a word comes through and it doesn't mean anything to you or you don't understand it, your guides want you to understand. They're there to help you understand. What you always have to do is ask them for clarity. So if you don't understand it, literally say, "Can you please clarify that for me? Can you please tell me what you mean by that?" Send another word, send another string of words until I understand. Your guides will continue to send more messages, more sounds, more visual cues until you get what they're trying to say. Unless you stay, they're going to assume that you understand it at the first message that comes through, unless you say otherwise. Don't forget that we do have to speak to our guides out loud, especially when we're beginning, because this is a relationship we are building with them. We want it to feel like we're having a conversation with them. And so don't forget to do that as well. And then whatever comes through, start to lean into the advice that comes up. Start to actually take action on the message that comes through. And because this is how we begin to trust the messages that come through. And so if your guide tells you to, I don't know, have this particular thing for dinner, and you go ahead and listen to that, and then you feel really great and you have a great night's sleep. And then afterwards you kind of go, okay, I'm glad I listened to that message. It was really helpful. Again, that may not prove it so much if you're quite skeptical. And, you might want to ask something that maybe has a little bit more meat to it, so to speak, where you can then begin to take action. Maybe it's, what's the next step in my business? What should I do today? What's one thing I can do today to help forward my business? Do it and then see positive results. Well, then you're going to trust that the message that came through really was channeled and intended for you. And again, it kind of becomes compound interest, right? You start to snowball from there and trust the messages that come through more and more and trust your abilities. So do call them in, ask for a question, and then, take action on what comes through. Okay. Um, I do want to remind you that, as I said before, the messages that come through are not necessarily going to feel entirely different from your own thoughts. The only way you can really distinguish is, does it feel centered and grounded? And if it doesn't, then perhaps you haven't done enough at the get go from the beginning to center and ground yourself before calling your guides in. You have to get away from your racing thoughts to be able to distinguish that these are not your racing thoughts coming through. So if you are not calm enough, if you're not grounded enough, if you're still thinking about today's agenda, you're not going to receive your clairaudient messages from your guides. You're going to only be hearing your own thoughts. So notice, are these voices, is the voice that's coming through quick and chattery and sort of critical and judgmental, or is it really grounding and soothing, soft, and maybe only one word at a time? So really start to play with this, and trust it as it does come through. Okay, so that's all I really do have to share about clairaudience. I know this is a shorter episode, but next week we're going to dive into claircognizance, which is clear knowing, which is a really, really powerful gift and possibly the hardest one to recognize if you have it. So we're definitely going to talk about that. And otherwise, I wish you so much luck as you practice channeling your clairaudience. Don't forget to rate this podcast, give me a 5-star review. I wish you so much luck as you continue to develop your channeling practice. And remember, the more you show up and try to build your relationship with your guides, the stronger your gifts will get. Sending lots of love and light your way, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.